Adarni Westhad, The Cold War, A World History, New York, Basic Books, 2017, 720 pp. $35.00. In 2005, the Yale historian John Lewis Gaddis released his book, The Cold War, A New History. Glowing reviews of the book followed in the New York Times and Foreign Affairs. Among the few dissenters was Tony Judt, a New York University historian who died in 2010. Judd had opposed the Iraq War, when so many other intellectuals, including Gaddis, joined in the delusions that George W. Bush could, should and would democratize the Middle East. By 2005, those fantasies were discredited by events in Mesopotamia, though Gaddis was unchastened, arguing in the American interest as late as 2008 that the senior goal of American foreign policy should be ending tyranny. 149 In the New York Review of Books, Judd argued that John Lewis Gaddis has written a history of America's Cold War, as seen from America, as experienced in America, and told in a way most agreeable to many American readers. However brilliant his works had been during the Cold War, Gaddis became an American triumphalist once the Berlin Wall collapsed. He had comparatively little understanding of the Soviet experience and, most egregiously, didn't seem to care much about the enormous damage both superpowers inflicted on what was then called the Third World. The result, Judd argued, was that the Cold War was a story still to be told. With Adarni Westhad's new book, the story is now told. Westhad is the co-author of several books on the Cold War, as well as co-editor of the 3-volume Cambridge History of the Cold War. He also wrote The Global Cold War, Third World Interventions and the Making of Our Times, which won the Bancroft Prize. As its title indicates, the Global Cold War suggested that the Cold War was very much a globe-spanning conflict, migrating into areas far beyond the borders of the two superpowers. His new book integrates that focus on the developing world with a more traditional emphasis on the great powers. It is aimed at a general rather than a scholarly audience, with far fewer footnotes or archival research than his previous works, more on that later. The Cold War, A World History is told chronologically, but unlike most books on the subject, it begins with the right period. The first well-regarded book on the war written from a post-Berlin Wall perspective was Martin Walker's Cold War, published in 1994. Like so many others to come, it began with the dissension in the Allied ranks in the closing years of World War II. By beginning with an earlier period, Westhad advances beyond that approach. He is able to devote some attention to the ideological sources of the struggle, which began with Lenin's interpretation of communism, prioritizing global revolution and antagonism toward the non-communist world. The Cold War was born from the global transformations of the late 19th century and was buried as a result of tremendously rapid changes 100 years later, he writes. Those changes include decolonization, the ascension of the United States to world power and the gradual decline of scientific socialism, as well as the two world wars. The Great War jump-started the destinies of the two future Cold War superpowers. It made the United States the global embodiment of capitalism and it made Russia a Soviet Union, a permanent challenge to the capitalist world. Westhad also makes the thought-provoking claim, rather unusual in a book on the Cold War, that it is therefore quite possible that the Cold War will be reduced in significance by future historians, who from their vantage point will attach more significance to the origins of Asian economic power, or the beginning of space exploration, or the eradication of smallpox. Westhad proceeds from there through all the stops along the way to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Separate chapters examine India, China, the Middle East and Latin America, as well as summaries of Richard Nixon's diplomacy and the reigns of Kennedy, Brezhnev, and Gorbachev. That he manages to do all this in largely sequential fashion is doubly impressive. The Cold War evinces a lifetime of research and thought on the subject. Compelling ideas and valuable insights appear frequently, such as, in spite of their attractiveness on a global scale, neither the Soviet nor the US system was ever fully replicated elsewhere. Or the explanation for communism's appeal in Vietnam. One reason, ironically, was the integration of Vietnamese elites into French culture and education, from whence the post-1914 generation took over the radicalization that was prevalent among French youth, too. Or, in Asia as in Europe, U.S. policy in the early Cold War was more oriented toward the expansion of capitalism as such than toward a unique preservation of U.S. national economic advantage or the interests of specific U.S. companies. Westad's assessment is that some sort of conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was inevitable.